The fall of the Roman Empire marked the beginning of the early Middle Ages, also sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. This period encompassed the next 500 years, and it received the name Dark Ages because it was seen as a period in which most of the knowledge of the classical world disappeared while society devolved into a bunch of small feudal states. Though the concept of this time period as the Dark Ages has long been challenged and is based on a number of misconceptions and biases, education on the matter still remains rather limited. So today we're going to look into some of the things that school definitely didn't teach you about the Dark Ages, the supposed Dark Ages. We generally think of the Dark Ages as being a time of feudal lords and monarchs wielding absolute and authoritarian power over their subjects. While that's not entirely untrue, it was often a whole lot more complicated than that. The specific details would vary wildly from one nation or feudal state to the next, but elections were actually surprisingly common, particularly in the latter half of the Dark Ages. Of course, these elections were nothing like modern elections where every adult citizen usually has the right to vote. At bare minimum, to vote, a person had to be an adult male landowner and usually a Christian as well. But even this was not enough to guarantee a vote. Voting tended to be reserved for the highest nobility and aristocracy, with elections for the highest officers having only a few dozen electors. There was certainly no way that commoners would have the right to vote for who was the next king or pope. The best case scenario for people's voices being heard would be to join a trade guild. The guilds wielded a meaningful amount of power and influence in major cities, and its members had the opportunity to elect the guild leaders. Apprentices and sometimes journeymen did not get to cast a vote, but a master baker or a physician would get to elect their respective guild leaders. These guild leaders would get to take part in mayoral elections. Those mayors would elect representatives of the proto-parliaments that existed at the time, and the parliament could elect the next king. Again, this is a best case scenario, and those without considerable wealth or status often lacked any agency in an election of such magnitude. And yes, sometimes there really were elections for the new monarch. Most elections at the time were for local or parliamentary positions, but in the event that a king left no male heir or there was a dispute over who was next in line, elections could really be held. Poland and Hungary in particular were known for their elective monarchy, though this practice wasn't exclusive to those nations. However, elections were handled much differently than they are today. Though it did happen, campaigning for a position was generally frowned upon, rather than being the norm. Plato's belief that only those who did not seek power are qualified to wield it was a popular notion, and the elections allowed for people to show that they had been forced to assume power rather than actively seeking it out. It was a common practice for those elected to show reluctance in accepting their new position. Although they were usually just feigning humility, even those elected king might ask for the vote to be redone before agreeing to assume power. Even if there was a revote, however, the results would never change because votes were expected to be unanimous. This was possible since these decisions were only being made by a roomful of electors rather than the general public, though it could be an extremely lengthy and complex process. If there were two rival factions, they would have a primary process similar to party primaries today. However, the factions would nominate a member of the opposing faction rather than their own. The electors would then begin a lengthy process of deliberation until a unanimous decision between the candidates could be reached. The reason for unanimity was twofold. First, major positions such as king or the pope were supposed to be seats of divine authority selected by God, who was speaking through the electors. A split decision would have meant that the electors had ignored the word of God, which could contain all sorts of consequences. And from a more secular point of view, a unanimous decision was much more practical. If someone was elected king by a single vote, it's unlikely that the unsuccessful candidate would accept that vote, and they might lead an armed rebellion against the throne. Now, this may all have been a hell of a far cry from actual democracy, but the political structure of society in the Dark Ages was far more complex and democratic than school would have led you to believe. The Dark Ages were given their derogatory name due to the perceived cultural and scientific decline during the time. As such, it may come as a surprise to many that there were not one, but two Renaissances during the Dark Ages. Granted, these were more limited in scope than the much more well-known Italian Renaissance. First was the Carolingian Renaissance, which took place in the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne united a large portion of Western and Central Europe under his rule, and with this new era of peace in the West, he brought with him a new age of enlightenment for the clergy. Anyway, the Carolingian Renaissance was almost exclusively limited to the clergy, and its status as a true Renaissance is somewhat contested. Not only was there the more limited scope than the Italian Renaissance, but the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't an age of newly created social and cultural movements. Instead, it was an effort to recreate the Roman Empire from centuries earlier. But that's not to say that it wasn't still important. Some credit this minor Renaissance as single-handedly pulling all Western civilization from the brink of collapse. And even if that's overstating things, it still proved highly influential on the later Italian Renaissance. The Carolingians sought to restore the ancient wisdom of Rome, and they painstakingly transcribed over 100,000 manuscripts featuring Roman texts. Thousands of those have survived to this day, with many of them being the oldest extant copies of famous works by the likes of Julius Caesar, Cicero, and Lucretius. As part of the transcription process, the Carolingians sought to create a more uniform and easier-to-read fonts with clearly defined capital and lowercase letters. This font was mistaken during the Italian Renaissance as the original Latin text, and it became the basis for modern Italian script. This version of medieval Latin, which also allowed for the creation of new words, became a universal language among scholars for centuries. One of the other major contributions of the Carolingian Renaissance was the creation of a standard curriculum for schools that's very similar to what you would have used in school as well. Again, this idea was not entirely new and was more of an attempt to recreate how education functioned in the Roman Empire, but it was still the foundation for the curriculum of the first true universities which would spring up in Europe during the coming centuries. Unfortunately, because the Carolingian Renaissance was limited in reach to the clergy rather than being a society-wide movement, the benefits were short-lived. Within just a couple of generations, much of which had been achieved, reverted back to the way things had been before Charlemagne's rule. The final century of the Dark Ages brought with it the Ottonian Renaissance, named after Holy Roman Emperors Otto I, II, and III, during whose reign it took place. However, while their support, particularly financial support, was crucial for this Renaissance, the efforts were largely spearheaded by Pope Sylvester II and Saint Abbot Fleury. In many ways, this was a continuation of the Carolingian Renaissance, so much so that it's sometimes referred to as the Third Carolingian Renaissance. Entire libraries were built of newly translated ancient texts. However, this Renaissance saw more of a focus on new ideas as well, even if these supposedly new ideas were all just being borrowed from somewhere else. The impetus for the Ottonian Renaissance was the marriage of Otto I of Saxony and Adelaide of Italy. This union of the German and Italian kingdoms brought the West closer to Byzantium, allowing Western Europe to borrow ideas and innovations from the East. The Byzantine influence was most notable in art and architecture, though there were major advances in science and mathematics that reached Western Europe thanks to the Ottonian Renaissance as well. Among these advances that Pope Sylvester II introduced to Western audiences was the spherical astrolabe, a combination of an astrolabe and an armillary sphere used to calculate celestial motion with incredible accuracy. Sylvester also introduced the system of Arabic numerals to Europe, though it would not see widespread use outside of Italy for another 500 years. While Europe saw some major advances during this time period, as we said, these weren't new ideas that originated as a result of the Renaissance. Instead, they were merely ideas being borrowed from elsewhere. But while it was Byzantine influence that gave rise to the Ottonian Renaissance, these ideas and inventions hadn't originated there either. Western education generally focuses on Western history, which certainly makes sense from a somewhat self-centered point of view. Byzantium is often grouped as part of this because of its close association with the Roman Empire, but the world is a really big place. What schools didn't teach you is that while Western Europe had been plunged into the Dark Ages following the fall of the Roman Empire, the Muslim world was currently experiencing its Golden Age. It began in the mid-7th century, during the reign of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid and the inauguration of the House of Wisdom, also known as the Grand Library of Baghdad. The House of Wisdom was built as a private library to store the Caliph's collection of rare texts, encompassing all of the classical knowledge of the ancient world. Scholars from all over the Muslim world traveled to Baghdad to translate these works into Arabic and Persian, which played a large part in Baghdad becoming the largest city in the world at the time. By itself, this gathering of the greatest scholars of the Muslim world to a location that housed all of the world's classical knowledge would have been enough to spark a golden age. But to throw even more fuel onto the fire, in the early 8th century, during the reign of Caliph al-Mamun, the House of Wisdom was changed from the Caliph's private collection into a public library and academy. This golden age lasted until the library was destroyed during the Mongolian siege of Baghdad in 1258. Of course, There was more to the creation of the Golden Age than just the existence of the library alone. It had to be worth everyone's time to come and assist in translating the classical works. Fortunately, the Quran placed a lot of emphasis on education and knowledge. There was a strong desire to both preserve the knowledge of past civilizations and to assimilate it into their own education. As such, the Islamic State was willing to pay a small fortune to fund the translation movement to convert all of the classical works to Persian and Arabic. When dealing with defunct currencies and over 1,000 years of inflation, it can be rather difficult to accurately state how much something so far in the past cost, but according to experts, the Abbasid Caliphate may have spent over $2 billion in today's money to fund the translation efforts. Though it's unclear whether that $2 billion price tag was per year or over the course of the entire movement, the same experts suggest that the most skilled translators received salaries comparable to modern professional athletes, which would suggest that it was $2 billion per year. This also happened to coincide with the introduction of paper to the Middle East. The Muslim world had been relying heavily on papyrus scrolls, but this was not an ideal solution. The papyrus plant is native to Egypt, and it was unable to be successfully farmed in any meaningful quantity elsewhere. Though papyrus fared much better in the climate of the Middle East than it did in Europe, the supply was still a major bottleneck. Even without the papyri being destroyed by humidity, they were still extremely fragile. But it was at this time that papermaking techniques made their way from China to the Islamic Empire, and paper mills were able to produce large quantities of paper that was far more reliable and durable than papyrus, and far cheaper and easier to produce than parchment. Unsurprisingly, these efforts providing access to translations of the entire classical world's knowledge led to some major advancements across a wide spectrum of disciplines. Aside from the advancement of theological and philosophical ideas that would be expected of the time, there were numerous major advancements across maths and science as well. We mentioned astrolabes earlier, and these were of particular interest to the Muslims. Because their religion requires them to pray at precise times throughout the day, making sure that the timekeeping methods that had been developed by the Greeks were accurate was considered crucial. This led to the development of the spherical astrolabe, which was significantly more precise than its two-dimensional predecessor. It was so precise, in fact, that by the time Europe was pulling itself out of the Dark Ages, Muslim astronomers were questioning how a geocentric solar system could possibly produce the results recorded from their astrolabes. While they hadn't identified that a heliocentric model of the solar system was correct, they were already considering it as a very real possibility. Another innovation, and one that you may or may not appreciate depending on how school went for you, was algebra. Maths in the ancient world consisted almost entirely of geometry and arithmetic, mostly geometry. Greek and Roman numerals could quickly become unwieldy when trying to do complicated maths or dealing with large numbers, and the development of Arabic numerals helped facilitate higher maths. And this is where Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, the founder of algebra, enters the picture. There was also Omar Khayyam, who is largely credited with creating the foundation of Cartesian or coordinate geometry, although a Greek mathematician had used something vaguely similar before. The Islamic Golden Age also led to the development of the law of sines, an important trigonomic equation. Hassan ibn al-Haytham, often referred to just as Al-Hazen, even laid out some of the foundations for calculus. Though he never formalized a general equation, Al-Hazen demonstrated a mastery over the concept of integration as it pertains to calculus. But that's not what Al-Hazen is actually best known for. He has been described as the world's first true scientist, playing a significant role in the development of the scientific method. He also broke away from the two prevailing theories of how vision worked. One theory suggested that vision worked by having light come out of the eyes, while the other suggested that the mere essence of objects would flow into the eyes, thus enabling a person to see the thing. Instead, Al-Hazen correctly suggested that light reflected off objects and into a person's eyes. There were major advancements in medicine as well. It was identified that scabies was caused by a parasite that could be removed without the need for bloodletting or other ridiculous treatments, that smallpox and measles were different diseases, and that hemophilia was hereditary. It was also during the Islamic Golden Age that ectopic pregnancies were first identified, which can be deadly if not treated. Even the seemingly obvious practice of using a control group for medicinal testing began during this Golden Age. Whether it was trying medicinal herbs as a treatment or bloodletting for yet another ailment, physicians recognized that control groups should be used to test whether or not the treatment was actually affecting patient outcomes. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And to be honest, the list of scientific and cultural advancements that were introduced to the world during the Islamic Golden Age are entirely too numerous to fit into one video. And yet, in many classrooms, this entire period was little more than a footnote compared to the events of the Dark Ages, if it even got mentioned at all. So we hope today we did a little to right that wrong. Thanks for watching.